In the winter of 1986, the waters around Yonaguni Island were calm in the way they often are before something unexpected is found. Yonaguni sits at the western edge of Japan, closer to Taiwan than to the country's main islands. It is known for strong currents, clear visibility, and seasonal gatherings of hammerhead sharks that attract divers from around the region. That was the reason Kihachiro Arataki, a local dive instructor and guide, was in the water that day. He was scouting dive sites, not searching for history. As Arataki descended beneath the surface, he noticed something that did not match the seafloor he knew so well. Instead of coral formations or scattered rock, a massive stone surface emerged below him. It was flat, unusually flat. As he moved closer, the shape continued, extending outward like a broad terrace. Then more appeared, sharp edges, straight lines, a series of step-like levels rising from the seabed. At first, Arataki assumed his perspective was misleading him. Underwater, scale can be deceptive. Light bends, shadows stretch. But as he swam along the structure, the pattern held. The formation was enormous, far larger than a single outcrop. Some sections rose more than 25 meters from the ocean floor, forming what looked like a tiered platform carved from solid stone. Arataki did not claim to know what he had found. He did what experienced divers do when they encounter something unfamiliar. He documented it. Over multiple dives, he photographed the site and recorded video footage, capturing wide angles and close-up views. The images showed broad stone plains intersecting at sharp angles. Corners appeared almost rectangular. The surfaces were worn, but not randomly shaped. When other local divers joined him, they saw the same thing. The structure was not hidden or small. It dominated the dive area. Yet until that point, it had gone largely unnoticed, partly because strong currents limited exploration, and partly because no one expected to find anything resembling architecture beneath the waves. Word began to spread beyond Yonaguni's diving community. The photographs reached researchers and journalists on mainland Japan. The reaction was cautious. Some observers were intrigued by how geometric the formation appeared. Others were skeptical, pointing out that nature can create surprising shapes, especially in sedimentary rock. What made the site difficult to dismiss outright was its scale and consistency. This was not a single block or isolated feature. It was a connected formation with terraces, vertical faces, and long straight edges extending across a wide area. Even those inclined toward natural explanations admitted that it looked unusual. By the late 1980s, the site had drawn the attention of Professor Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist at the University of the Ryukyus in Okinawa. Kimura specialized in underwater geology and coastal formations. He was familiar with the rock types found around the Ryukyu Islands and understood how tectonic forces shape the region. Kimura approached Yonaguni with professional caution. He did not arrive to confirm a lost civilization. His initial goal was documentation. Using dive surveys, measurements, and geological analysis, he began mapping the formation in detail. His work marked a shift in how Yonaguni was discussed. It was no longer just a diver's curiosity. It had entered academic conversation. Early surveys confirmed what divers had reported. The structure was composed primarily of sandstone, a sedimentary rock known to fracture along straight plains. But the arrangement of those fractures, combined with the monument's size, made simple explanations difficult. Kimura documented features that looked like steps, platforms, and sharp corners that repeated across the site. Photographs from these surveys circulated widely. To the public, the images were striking. They suggested something halfway between a natural cliff and a constructed monument. To scientists, they raised questions rather than answers. Could geological processes alone account for such regularity? Or was human involvement possible at some stage? It is important to understand what was not found at this point. No tools were recovered. No pottery shards, carvings, or inscriptions were documented. There were no statues, no symbolic markings, no clear signs of habitation. What existed was stone, shaped in a way that resisted easy classification. This lack of artifacts became a defining feature of the mystery. In underwater archaeology, context matters as much as form. Structures associated with human activity are usually accompanied by debris from daily life. At Yonaguni, there was none. That absence pushed many researchers toward caution. At the same time, the structure's sheer presence refused to be ignored. Yonaguni did not resemble known shipwrecks or submerged harbors. It was not a scatter of blocks or collapsed walls. It was a single massive formation integrated into the seafloor itself. As interest grew, so did debate. Some researchers argued that calling it a monument was premature. Others felt the term described its appearance, not its origin. Language itself became part of the controversy. Names can shape expectations, and Yonaguni was now being framed as a deep-sea mystery, whether intended or not. Media coverage amplified this tension. Headlines hinted at lost underwater cities or ancient ocean discoveries, even when the scientists involved avoided such claims. Kimura himself was careful in his early statements. He emphasized uncertainty and the need for continued study. What Yonaguni represented at this stage was not proof of anything extraordinary. It was a challenge to classification. It sat at the edge of known categories, forcing geologists and archaeologists to explain why it looked the way it did. For underwater archaeology, this was not unusual. Many submerged landscapes appear strange when first discovered. Erosion, pressure, and time alter rock in ways that feel unfamiliar when viewed beneath the sea. Still, Yonaguni stood out because of how closely it resembled intentional design. As surveys continued through the 1990s, the site became one of the most photographed, unexplained ruins underwater, even though no one could agree on whether it was truly a ruin at all. That tension between appearance and evidence became the heart of the story. At this point in the mystery, no conclusions were possible. What could be said with certainty was limited but important. A large stone formation existed off the coast of Yonaguni Island. It was documented by divers, filmed, photographed, and mapped. It displayed flat surfaces, sharp edges, and step-like features on a monumental scale. And it resisted simple explanation. What it was, how it formed, and whether humans ever touched it remained open questions. Yonaguni was not presented as a lost civilization or a submerged city. It was something quieter and in many ways more compelling. A real structure in a real place, challenging scientists to explain it without assuming too much. That was how the mystery began, not with a legend or an ancient text, but with a diver, a camera, and a stone shape beneath the sea that refused to be easily understood. As the tension around Yonaguni grew, the conversation slowly shifted. After the initial surprise of discovery, researchers began asking a quieter but more important question. Before assuming anything extraordinary, what does the land itself tell us? To answer that, scientists had to step back from the shape of the structure and look at the larger geological story of the region where it sits. Yonaguni Island is part of the Ryukyu Islands, a chain that stretches between southern Japan and Taiwan. This region lies along the boundary where tectonic plates interact. Earthquakes are not rare here. They are expected. Over millions of years, constant movement beneath the Earth's surface has lifted land, fractured rock, and reshaped coastlines again and again. Any discussion of unexplained ruins or sunken structures in this area has to begin with that reality. The bedrock around Yonaguni is mostly sandstone, a sedimentary rock formed when layers of sand are compressed over long periods of time. Sandstone does not behave like volcanic rock or granite. It forms in layers, almost like pages in a book. When pressure is released, or when stress builds along fault lines, those layers tend to crack in straight lines. Geologists call these cracks joint fractures, and they often occur at right angles. This matters because many of the features that make the Yonaguni Formation look artificial are exactly the features sandstone produces naturally. Flat plains, sharp edges, step surfaces. When erosion removes weaker material, stronger layers remain, creating terraces. When fractures intersect, they can form corners that appear almost geometric. Several geologists who examined the site emphasized this point early on. They argued that Yonaguni should not be viewed in isolation. Above the waterline on Yonaguni Island itself, similar formations can be seen. Coastal cliffs show the same layered sandstone breaking into block-like shapes. In some places, the resemblance is striking. The only difference is that one is exposed to air and the other is submerged. The ocean changes how rock looks. Water filters light, softens contrast, and creates shadows that shift with movement. Algae and marine growth cling to edges, highlighting lines that might go unnoticed on land. Underwater, a flat surface feels more intentional because there are fewer reference points. A diver floating beside a rock wall does not have trees, buildings, or horizons to judge scale. This is where perception becomes part of the story. Humans are extremely good at finding patterns, even when none were intended. It is a survival trait. Faces in clouds, shapes in shadows. When divers first filmed Yonaguni, the camera angles often emphasized symmetry because that is what drew the eye. Over time, those images became iconic, reinforcing the impression of design. Geologists studying the footage pointed out something subtle. When the same structures are viewed from different angles, many of the clean lines lose their regularity. Surfaces that appear smooth up close are uneven when seen from farther away. What looks like a staircase from one direction looks like a sloping fracture from another. Another factor is seismic stress. Earthquakes do not just shake the ground. They create fractures deep within rock layers. Over long periods, repeated stress can cause large sections to shear off along straight planes. If sea levels later rise, as they did after the last ice age, those fractured formations can end up underwater, preserved in place. This explanation fits well with what is known about sea level change. Around 12,000 to 8,000 years ago, melting glaciers caused oceans to rise significantly. Coastlines shifted. Areas that were once dry land became submerged. But submersion alone does not imply human construction. It simply explains how a geological formation could end up beneath the sea. One of the strongest arguments made by skeptics of a human-made origin is the absence of cultural evidence. In underwater archaeology, structures tied to human activity are rarely alone. Even very old submerged sites usually contain fragments of daily life. Pottery shards, stone tools, hearths, bones. At Yonaguni, none of these have been found. Multiple dives and surveys over decades have failed to uncover carvings, inscriptions, tool marks, or construction debris. The surfaces show natural weathering rather than chisel patterns. For many scientists, this absence is not a small detail. It is central. Without artifacts, the case for a submerged civilization becomes extremely weak. Some supporters of a man-made interpretation have argued that erosion could have removed such evidence. Geologists counter that erosion does not selectively erase cultural material while leaving massive stone surfaces intact. Small objects often survive where large ones do not. Their absence suggests they were never there. This does not mean Yonaguni is uninteresting or unworthy of study. In fact, many researchers argue the opposite. The site is valuable precisely because it shows how natural processes can produce formations that challenge intuition. It forces scientists to explain clearly how geology works, especially in underwater environments where visual cues are limited. There is also a broader lesson here about underwater archaeology and ancient ocean discoveries. The ocean floor is not a blank slate. It is shaped by the same forces that shape land, only filtered through water, time, and pressure. When people encounter sunken structures that look organized, the temptation is to reach for lost underwater cities or submerged civilizations. Sometimes that instinct leads to real discoveries. Often it leads to misinterpretation. Yonaguni sits at that intersection. It is a deep-sea mystery not because it defies explanation, but because the explanation feels unsatisfying to many observers. Natural does not always mean simple. Nature can be dramatic, angular, and surprising. Scientists who argue for a geological origin are not dismissing the mystery. They are narrowing it. They ask not whether humans built it, but why the rock fractured the way it did, why erosion emphasized certain features, and how underwater conditions shape perception. Those are real questions with measurable answers. Importantly, even among skeptics, there is agreement on one point. The formation deserves careful documentation. Detailed mapping, 3D modeling, and continued observation help refine understanding. Applying consistent standards matters, especially in cases that attract public fascination. This approach also protects real submerged sites from being overshadowed. When every unusual rock formation is framed as evidence of a lost civilization, genuine archaeological discoveries risk being dismissed by association. By grounding interpretation in evidence, researchers preserve credibility across the field. As this chapter closes, the mystery of Yonaguni remains intact, but more clearly defined. There is no need to invoke vanished empires to explain what is visible. Known geological processes offer a coherent explanation, even if that explanation challenges expectations. The structure looks artificial because the human brain wants it to be. Straight lines feel intentional, steps feel designed. Underwater, those impressions grow stronger, but science asks a harder question. Not what it looks like, but how it formed. At Yonaguni, the case for nature is not an attempt to close the conversation. It is an attempt to ground it. The real intrigue lies not in what people hope to find, but in understanding how Earth itself can produce forms that blur the line between design and accident. And that tension between appearance and process is what keeps Yonaguni discussed. Not as proof of lost underwater cities, but as a reminder that the planet still has the power to surprise, even when the answer is written in stone. As geological explanations settled into the discussion, the story of Yonaguni did not end. For some researchers, the natural explanation explained much, but not everything. Certain features still felt deliberate, or at least altered. This is where the debate became more focused, and where one name continued to appear: Professor Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus. Kimura first became involved with the site in the late 1990s, after the initial wave of diver footage had already drawn public attention. As a marine geologist, he approached Yonaguni with training rooted in earth science, not mythology. Over years of dives, surveys, and measurements, he documented the structure in detail, producing maps, photographs, and three-dimensional reconstructions. His position has always been careful but clear. Kimura does not argue that Yonaguni is a fully artificial city built from scratch. Instead, he suggests a hybrid explanation. In his view, the base formation is natural sandstone shaped by geological forces, but parts of it may have been modified by human activity at some point in the distant past. The features he points to are specific: broad, flat platforms that appear intentionally leveled, step-like formations with consistent rise and run, straight edges that extend longer than expected for random fractures. In some areas, Kimura has suggested the presence of what look like quarry marks, places where stone may have been removed or shaped. These observations led him to a central question. If humans had access to this formation when it was above water, could they have altered it? To explore that possibility, researchers had to look beyond the stone itself and consider sea level history. This is one area where there is broad scientific agreement. During the last ice age, global sea levels were significantly lower than they are today. Around 12,000 years ago, large amounts of water were still locked in glaciers. Coastlines extended farther outward. Areas that are now underwater were once dry land. In the region around Yonaguni, estimates suggest sea levels may have been tens of meters lower than today. This means the formation could have been exposed, at least partially during that period. That exposure window matters because it overlaps with known human presence in Japan. Archaeological evidence confirms that humans lived in the Japanese archipelago well before 10,000 years ago. These populations were hunter-gatherers, moving in small groups, relying on stone tools, fishing, and foraging. They did not leave behind cities, temples, or large monuments comparable to those found in later agricultural societies. Still, basic stoneworking was not beyond them. Humans had been shaping stone for hundreds of thousands of years, cutting, scraping, and modifying rock surfaces with simple tools is a well-documented capability. Supporters of Kimura's view argue that altering an existing rock formation is very different from constructing a monument from the ground up. From this perspective, Yonaguni would not represent a lost underwater city or advanced civilization. It would represent localized modification, perhaps for practical or ritual reasons that are no longer recoverable. A flattened platform, a stepped access point, small changes layered onto a natural base. However, this is where the debate sharpens. Critics point out that while early humans could shape stone, there is no evidence in Japan of monument-scale stone modification from this period. Known sites from the Yeoman period, which begins around 14,000 years ago, include dwellings, pottery, and tools, but not large stone structures carved into bedrock. This absence matters. Archaeology relies heavily on patterns. When a behavior is common, it usually leaves traces in multiple places. If early communities in Japan were modifying massive stone formations, similar evidence would be expected elsewhere. So far, none has been found. There is also the issue of context. Even if parts of Yonaguni were altered, researchers cannot agree on why. No inscriptions suggest religious use. No artifacts suggest habitation. No tools link the site to a specific culture. Without context, interpretation becomes fragile. Kimura himself has acknowledged these limits. Over time, his interpretations have evolved. Early claims were broader. Later work became more cautious, emphasizing possibilities rather than conclusions. This shift reflects the difficulty of working in underwater archaeology, where access is limited and evidence is harder to recover. Another challenge is scale. Features that appear step-like underwater may not be uniform when measured precisely. Small variations in height and angle can indicate natural processes rather than intentional design. Critics argue that once detailed measurements are taken, many of the steps lose their regularity. Yet supporters respond that human modification does not require perfect geometry. Early stonework was often rough, uneven, and adapted to natural forms. Expecting precision comparable to later civilizations may be an unfair standard. This back and forth highlights why Yonaguni remains an unresolved case. The available evidence allows more than one interpretation, but it does not strongly confirm any of them. Importantly, even among those open to partial human involvement, there is no unified theory. Some suggest quarrying, others suggest ritual use. Some propose nothing more than minimal shaping. These ideas do not reinforce each other. They remain separate possibilities without shared support. That lack of consensus is telling. In cases where human activity is clear, interpretations may differ, but the underlying fact of human presence is not in doubt. At Yonaguni, the debate begins earlier, at the level of whether modification occurred at all. This uncertainty has practical consequences. Without clear evidence of human alteration, the site cannot be classified as an archaeological ruin in the traditional sense. It remains primarily a geological formation of unusual appearance, studied with archaeological questions in mind but not defined by them. Still, the discussion itself has value. Yonaguni has forced researchers to think carefully about how early humans interacted with landscapes. It has encouraged closer study of submerged coastlines, where evidence of ancient activity may lie hidden. In that sense, the monument has influenced ancient ocean discoveries beyond its own location. It has also highlighted the challenges of interpreting sunken structures. Underwater, erosion works differently. Visual distortion is constant. Even experienced divers can disagree on what they are seeing. Photographs freeze moments but flatten depth. Video adds motion but shifts perspective. These conditions make certainty difficult. They also explain why the debate has remained measured rather than explosive within academic circles. Most researchers acknowledge the site's ambiguity. They resist definitive claims, whether natural or human-made. As this chapter draws to a close, Yonaguni stands at a crossroads of interpretation. On one side is a strong geological explanation, supported by known processes and comparable formations. On the other is the possibility, still unproven, that humans may have left subtle marks on a natural structure when the sea was lower. The mystery deepens not because extraordinary conclusions are confirmed, but because the evidence does not force a single answer. It allows room for careful disagreement. Yonaguni is not a lost underwater city waiting to be revealed, nor is it simply a meaningless pile of rock. It is a case study in limits. The limits of evidence, the limits of perception, the limits of what can be known when time, water, and stone intersect. And in that space between certainty and speculation, the question remains open. Decades after its discovery, Yonaguni still sits quietly beneath the surface of the sea, unchanged in shape, but never settled in meaning. That, more than anything else, explains why the debate continues. There are very few points everyone disagrees on. The structure is real. It exists off the coast of Yonaguni Island in southern Japan. It is large, visually striking, and unlike most underwater rock formations people are used to seeing. What remains unresolved is a single difficult question. Did humans play any role in shaping it at any point in the past? That question has survived not because evidence keeps pointing in one direction, but because the evidence refuses to settle completely in either. In many historical debates, new discoveries eventually tip the balance. A tool is found, a carving is uncovered, a layer of sediment is dated. At Yonaguni, that moment has never arrived. One reason lies in the reality of underwater archaeology itself. Working beneath the sea is slow, expensive, and limited. Strong currents pass through the area around Yonaguni, making long dives difficult. Visibility changes constantly depending on weather and season. Marine life covers surfaces quickly, hiding details beneath algae, coral, and encrusting organisms. Unlike land sites, archaeologists cannot simply clear away layers of soil to expose deeper levels. Excavation underwater risks damaging the very features being studied. This makes definitive testing extremely hard. On land, a structure can be excavated layer by layer, revealing tools, construction debris, or signs of human activity beneath and around it. Underwater, especially on solid bedrock, those contextual clues are often missing or inaccessible. At Yonaguni, researchers are left mostly with surface observation and measurement. Modern technology has helped, but only to a point. Sonar mapping has produced detailed images of the surrounding seafloor. Three-dimensional models created from diver surveys and computer reconstruction allow researchers to examine the structure from different angles without being physically present. These tools have improved documentation and accuracy. They have not changed the underlying shapes. The terraces remain flat. The edges remain sharp. The angles remain striking. What those features represent is still open to interpretation. Technology can show what is there. It cannot, on its own, explain how it came to be. This is why interpretations remain divided even among professionals. Geologists trained to recognize natural fracture patterns see familiar processes at work. Archaeologists trained to look for cultural context see its absence as decisive. Researchers open to partial human modification see possibilities but not confirmation. Each position is grounded in evidence. None is able to exclude the others entirely. Public interest adds another layer. Yonaguni exists in a space where science and visual impression collide. To a casual viewer, the formation looks intentional. It looks like steps, platforms, and walls. That reaction is natural. Humans are pattern-seeking. We are especially sensitive to straight lines and right angles because they are rare in everyday natural environments. Underwater, this effect is amplified. Shadows are deeper, light bends. Scale is hard to judge. A ledge that looks like a staircase may be several meters high. A straight edge may be a coincidence of fracture planes. Photographs and videos freeze moments without context, inviting interpretation without measurement. This visual ambiguity is part of what keeps Yonaguni alive in the public imagination. It feels like a deep-sea mystery, not because it promises a lost underwater city, but because it resists quick explanation. It challenges assumptions about what natural processes can produce and what early humans could have altered. Importantly, the mystery does not depend on belief in advanced ancient technology or forgotten global civilizations. No credible researcher argues that Yonaguni proves the existence of a sophisticated submerged empire. That idea exists mostly outside academic discussion. What remains within the discussion is far more restrained and far more interesting. Yonaguni forces a reconsideration of boundaries. How strictly should natural and human categories be separated? How much modification is required before something becomes cultural rather than geological? What level of evidence is enough to make that call underwater, where context is limited? These questions do not have simple answers. They also do not have to. In science, unresolved cases are not failures. They are reminders that evidence comes with limits. Over time, some mysteries fade because they are solved. Others fade because they are dismissed. Yonaguni has done neither. It has remained because it continues to be studied carefully without rushing toward certainty. Researchers return to it not to prove a point, but to refine their understanding of submerged landscapes and the methods used to study them. In that sense, Yonaguni has already contributed to ancient ocean discoveries, even without a final conclusion. It has helped sharpen standards. It has shown how easily visual impressions can mislead. It has reinforced the need for patience in underwater archaeology, where absence of evidence must be treated differently than on land. There is also a broader lesson here about history itself. The historical record is incomplete, Much of human activity took place along coastlines that are now underwater. Rising seas at the end of the last ice age reshaped the world dramatically. Some evidence was preserved, much was lost. This does not mean anything imagined must be true, but it does mean gaps are real. Yonaguni sits inside one of those gaps. It may never be definitively labeled natural